just to continue the family chronology, I mean, there was the tragic death of Feuermann at age 39. Your mother was his only child, 4 years old at the time of his death, right? So how did the generations go forward now? Your mother grew up, she married your father, so
well, my mother...
Tell us about that and tell us about you.
Okay, well, my mother, Feuermann, her father, died when she was 4 years old. She didn't know that he had died until she was 8. And she used to tell me that at that time that was half her life that she lived, not understanding why her father wasn't coming to visit her. She just thought he was on tour.
They couldn't tell her.
And my grandmother just didn't know how to explain to her young child, that he had died. And
True.
I don't know, memory and fantasy can sometimes get conflated. And in my memory, my mother explained to me that she was told, okay, so after Feuermann died, my mother was raised by her mother, Eva, Feuermann's widow, her grandmother, Emma, had emigrated to the States.
The controlling one.
The controlling one.
Yes.
And also, at that time, Emma's sister, Nellie. Tanta Nellie. Yeah, for some reason she was there briefly, not for a long time. So my mother was raised by these two, sometimes three grand women, very European, in Westchester. They never worked. And I think it was her Tanta Nellie that told her. She was sitting on a stairwell. For some reason, I have a vision of her sitting on a stairwell when she was told that actually he had passed away. And she was 8 years old at that point. So I think that did a number on her, and she talked about it quite a bit at different times in our lives.
What did she say?
I think she was angry at her mother for not having told her at a younger age, because she went from being 4 to 8 thinking her father didn't love her enough to come see her. So I'm a psychoanalyst, could have a field day with that, but she was aware that it had some kind of an impact on her psychology,
how
at
could
least,
it not? Yes.
And so she was raised in Scarsdale. She went to whatever high school was there. She went to Smith College. While she was in Smith College, my grandmother Eva remarried Hans Lenson. I think he was a mathematician of some kind. And he had been working in Guatemala, actually, and started a school in Guatemala. Strangely enough, one of my best friends from college, when we met a million years later, her mother had taught at that school. Anyway, you never know. So my mother went to Smith College after Smith, and she was a pianist. She's always a pianist studying. And she went off to Vienna to study piano. And wherever she was studying in Vienna, she was there with Alfred Brendel and Zubin Mehta, I believe, were there.
Not bad.
And my mother was a beautiful woman. I mean, inside, but also physically, an absolutely beautiful woman. And as a child, and since her death, I'm made aware often from men that knew her how beautiful, and that I loved her. And she was very incredibly unhappy in Vienna. And she didn't have the stomach to be a performer, she told me.
How old was she at the time she was in Vienna?
22, 24.
Uh-huh.
And my grandmother told me years later that my mother would come home for visits to Scarsdale, and she would see in my mother's suitcase there were all these like antidepressant pills and whatever version of that was back then in the 60s. And my mother she even told me once on stage at a recital at Smith, she peed in her pants on stage. She had such stage fright, and she just wasn't made for it.
I mean, she was the daughter of Emanuel Feuermann. I mean, that could also be psychoanalyzed, but there's got to be pressure there somehow,
totally.
Subconsciously,
and
or
she
not,
wasn't
right?
comfortable on stage. It wasn't the place for her.
Yeah.
But she was.
At that point in her life, when she was at Smith, and even was her last name Feuermann?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, it was too much.
Yeah, that's too much.
It was just too much.
Yes,
And she didn't have a natural inclination. She had perfect pitch.
Uh-huh.
And a beautiful musician, I think, but she just didn't have the stomach for being a performer and for the pressure of being Feuermann's daughter.
Yeah.
So she came back from Vienna, and then she went to Harvard for master's in education.
A brilliant woman. Yeah.
And I think that's where she really got her footing in terms of who she really was. And she had something to do with establishing the Cambridge Friends School here, and was very interested in education, and not the standard forms of education. She was interested in integration and alternative education, hence like a French school or a Montessori school type things.
What is Friends School? Is that a Quaker school?
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
I think she got caught up in the Quaker thing a little bit at some point. But she was realized, I mean, this is, my mother died when I was 21, so what I know is things she told me when I was much younger.
So, your family has a history of parents dying young.
Yes, and then I also have a history of my biddies that lived to be 95 and 100 years old.
Wow.
So it's a strange, tragic deaths and then ancient people. But anyway, she decided she felt like she could be of more use if she was teaching kids who needed better teachers. So she moved to New York City, and she moved to the Upper West Side, which at the time in the 60s, there was always wealth there on Central Park West and Riverside, but there was also, where their club was, for example, I remember when they were trying to find investors.
Who's they?
My parents were trying to find investors to their jazz club that they wanted to open in 1980. On the Upper West Side, and people were like, you can't open a place on Amsterdam Avenue. No white people will ever go there, so you'll never make any money. And now, you would never know that there weren't white people everywhere in that neighborhood. So at that time, when my mother in the 60s moved to 88th Street in Columbus, it was a largely Dominican and black neighborhood. And she worked at, I think, PS 84. So her students were mostly black and Dominican, Puerto Rican kids, I think. And that was her intention, was like she thought those were the kids that needed her more than the rich white kids. And she was involved in it was the 60s, so she was interested in integration, justice, alternative forms of education. And as a result, there was something called, what was it called? Oh my God, my aunts would kill me. There was a nursery school.
This almost sounds like a rebellion against her wealthy upbringing. And
I'm sure there was a
Star
part
Sale
of it.
Yes,
She wasn't really a rebel. She was very European in her way, so she wasn't like rebellious, but she for sure had issues with her mother never working, being raised by 3 women who didn't work, and she was always, a number of men asked her to marry them, like famous people who I won't mention, but she was not interested in that for whatever reason. I don't know if she was conscious of it at the time or, some sort of latent thing, but because of her activism basically in education, she was invited to a party by a friend, and that party happened to be the birthday party for my Uncle Clarence, my father's brother, on 104th and Central Park West at the time. And my Aunt Dot, who was married to my Uncle Clarence on my father's side, there's a very famous photograph of her, Dorothy Pittman and Gloria Steinem, like this. It makes the rounds everywhere now.
Wow.
And it was through Dorothy my mother knew, because she was an activist. Dorothy Pittman, she is an activist in education. And it was at a party that she threw for her husband Clarence, who was my father's brother, that my parents met at a party in 1968 or 69 in New York City. And they both said it was love at first sight. And it's amazing. My father is a black American man, born and raised in Rensselaer, New York, one of 11 children. His parents came up from Virginia for work. Raised 11 children on very, very little, and everybody has like advanced degrees, and the next generation, the kids of those people have done fine.
Hard to, I'd be the last one to psychoanalyze, but when you think of Feuermann coming out of the Jewish ghetto and finding a Reifenberger to marry, and then your father, a black man, coming out of, I guess what we might call an American ghetto.
Definitely not a ghetto at all.
Not a ghetto.
No, not at all. At that time, Rensselaer, New York was a very livable working class neighborhood. There were
Working
two black
families.
The rest were white, but they didn't know. My aunts will tell me, they didn't know they were poor. They weren't for lack of anything, So definitely not a ghetto. It wasn't I think my grandparents worked their tails off. There's no question. And, but.
Your grandparents on your father's side, yes.
But they were not, it was not the ghetto by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, my parents had very different backgrounds.
Your father certainly didn't have the kind of money in his family that your mother did.
No.
Yeah.
And my mother, when they met, had been to Smith and graduated cum laude from Smith and Harvard. And my father graduated college when I was 10. I remember coming home and there was his diploma, and we were like at a huge celebration. So,
Wow.
yeah, they There were many stories of their love affair, but yeah, they fell madly in love.